Welcome to Bloomberg Law on Demand. I'm Lee Pacchia. A decade ago, scholarships to attend law schools based on merit were rare. Now more than 1 in 4 students is on a merit-based scholarship. Joining us now to discuss, we have Jerry Organ. He's a professor at the law school from the University of St. Thomas, and he's the author of Impact of Merit-Based Scholarship Programs on the Culture of Law Schools. Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you
Good
for
to be
coming
here.
in. Why write on this subject?
I had nothing to do with admissions or scholarships in my first 10 years of teaching at the University of Missouri in Columbia. But when I came to St. Thomas, we were a new school. We didn't have a lot of staff or faculty, and somebody had to help out with admissions, and I started doing it. And one of the things I discovered is that our scholarship program, which I would describe as a non-competitive scholarship program, if we give you a scholarship and you remain in good academic standing, you keep your scholarship.
How many schools have a program like that?
Maybe based on the information I've been able to identify, maybe 24, maybe a couple more than that. So what I began to discover is that ours was unusual, as I would talk to our director of admissions about competing scholarship offers. And I began to realize that a lot of schools have competitive scholarship programs and that students aren't very sophisticated necessarily about that difference, about the fact that one scholarship they keep for 3 years and one they may lose after the first year. Mm-hmm. So that got me interested in finding out more about exactly how many schools have each kind of program, and got me interested in writing about it.
We've seen a rise in the amount of students on these types of scholarships in law school. What accounts for that?
I think so a brief history. I went to law school almost 30 years ago at Vanderbilt, and I went to Vanderbilt rather than Harvard because Vanderbilt offered me a merit scholarship. Mm-hmm. At the time, there were very few schools that offered merit scholarships. I looked. That's what I needed. U.S. News came into existence, the U.S. News and World Report rankings came into existence in the late 1980s. They've been annual since 1991, I believe. 25% of the rankings are LSAT and GPA, undergraduate GPA, and schools are trying to improve their objective criteria.
Right.
And one way to do that is offer merit scholarships to attract people who have that profile, the high LSAT, high GPA.
Mm-hmm. Aside from the standings, how else do these scholarships help law schools? I mean, I would imagine it seems somewhat counterintuitive. It's less revenue for the school. So increasing the amount of your student body that is on this type of scholarship would hurt the bottom line analysis.
Well, the bottom line, okay, so here you get into a little economic riddle, right? Schools need to generate a sufficient amount of revenue to cover their budget. If they are increasing the amount of scholarship assistance they have, what do? They increase tuition, and those who aren't on scholarship are paying more so that the school can meet its revenue. Mm. So schools, you may think this is a net loser for schools in terms of revenue. Across a class of students, it's not. They just increase tuition. And you may think, well, how long can tuition be increased? That's a great question. One of the challenges is, as long as there is federal loan assistance available to cover the cost of legal education, tuition, and cost of living, students seem, up until recently, to be almost immune to price. Mm. Now, it seems like that has changed in the last year or two.
Certainly. Let's get to the controversy now. There was a major story out in the New York Times last month about how it's mathematically impossible, given the way law schools institute a curve on their student bodies, for everyone to keep their merit scholarship. It's a fact of life.
Right.
Why are we in this situation, and what can be done about it?
Well, I think we're in this situation because what law schools are trying to do is get the best profile for their first year class. They want to bring in as many students with high LSATs and high GPAs. And so those with competitive scholarship programs front load the first year. Mm-hmm. It's a non-sustainable amount of funding. You have to get some of it back in the second and third year to sustain that level of funding in the first year. And the way you do that is you offer maybe half your class a scholarship, but you tell them they have to be in the top quarter. You just don't tell them that half of them have to be in the top quarter.
And how common is this practice?
Well, according to the research I've been able to do in trying to identify different types of scholarship programs at different schools, roughly 55 to 60%. Well, first of all, it's hard to get this information. Schools aren't very transparent about what type of scholarship program they have. based on the information I could identify, 55 to 60% of the ABA-accredited law schools have a competitive scholarship program. What I can't tell you right now is what percentage of those have a competitive scholarship program where they clearly are offering more scholarships than can be renewed. Mm-hmm. There might be some that are offering a limited number of scholarships, and conceivably all those people could be renewed if they performed well.
Right. This is being called a bait and switch scheme.
Yes, it is.
Is this something that law schools are trying harder to inform their students, their prospective students? That
well, the New York Times article has brought a fair amount of attention to this. The ABA is bringing attention to this. I happen to believe the non-competitive model is a better model in terms of the culture of the law school. It creates a less competitive law school. It promotes more collaborative learning. But frankly, I don't care what kind of program law schools have. I just want law schools to be clear so that students can make informed choices. So I do think there's going to be pressure from both students themselves and from regulatory bodies for better information on renewal rates for merit scholarships.
Now, in your research, have you determined which schools make it harder for students to keep their scholarships, and which ones make it easier, or is that?
I have a list of schools. I have appendices to the article I've put together. I'm going to be updating that so it's as current as it can be. It's actually pretty. If you think in terms of U.S. News rankings, it's distributed pretty broadly throughout the rankings. There is probably a weighting, a somewhat significant weighting of competitive scholarship programs among third-tier and fourth-tier law schools as opposed to first- and second-tier law schools. But there are first- and second-tier law schools that have competitive scholarship programs. The non-competitive programs, about half of those are in schools that are ranked in the top third. So you have very well-regarded schools that are being very generous to your students. The other half are distributed between the second and third tier, maybe into the fourth tier. St. Thomas is presently ranked in the third tier. We have a non-competitive scholarship program.
There seems to be a disconnect here. Do you expect an outside regulator, perhaps Congress, to step in and require law schools to have greater transparency in these matters?
Do I expect that? Well, Senator Boxer has written to the ABA about the employment statistics issue, which is a separate issue about which schools have not been as transparent as many would like. It's possible that Congress looks at this. The Department of Education has looked at for-profit educational institutions regarding various questions that might involve misleading data regarding graduates and their employment prospects. Is it possible that the Department of Education gets involved in this? It's possible. I think realistically the place where the regulation is going to take place is through the ABA.
Do you think they can self-police to the point where this is going to be somewhat more fair and equitable?
I think so. The ABA Questionnaire Committee gathers data and publishes data. That's one place there can be more transparency. There's also a separate committee called the Standards Review Committee that looks at the accreditation standards for law schools. There's a subcommittee of that that's looking at Standard 509, which is the Consumer Information Standard. And the chair of the subcommittee dealing with Standard 509 is aware of this issue and is, I believe, proposing language to address this issue. Mm-hmm. So it may be addressed in a couple of contexts.
What do people think this is doing to the long-term prospects for law schools themselves? I mean, are they viewing this as something that is critically affecting their long-term value proposition, if you will, or is?
Well, I think this specific issue is one more issue that has given law schools a bit of a black eye in terms of the lack of transparency. Employment statistics is one issue. This is one issue, and these issues have been on the web. Various blogs have been talking about these things. Prospective law students are increasingly aware of this. Applications are down this year, which would suggest people are cognizant of this. Let me take the long-term value proposition in two respects. At one level, law schools with competitive scholarship programs aren't thinking long-term. If they were, they'd be worried about having satisfied alums, and to have maybe a third of your class be very upset with you because of a perceived bait and switch that resulted in their loss of financial assistance and having to borrow more and leaving school as a bitter person isn't good in the long term for the alumni relations of that law school. So I don't think law schools are thinking sufficiently about the long-term value proposition. But if there's better information out there, if there, some people talk about there being a bubble in legal education, like there was a bubble in the housing market. Is it possible that that bubble bursts a little bit and fewer people come to law school and fewer law schools exist? That's possible.
There's some people that say that needs to happen.
Right, and that might happen, and this is not going to be the precipitating cause of that, but this is going to be one of those, one of the factors that contributes to that.
Have you looked at all at need-based scholarships? The New York Times article mentioned that there are fewer of them than there were previously. What to make of that trend?
I've tried to look at some of that information. I've tried to gather data on a pretty long time frame, going back to the 90s. There's not a lot of good data, but there does seem to be a decline in need-based aid, and I think that's a factor and perhaps a problem. If you have less need-based aid, then those who are financially less capable of affording law school, those who are lower income, are less likely to be joining the legal profession. And that's a diversity issue in my view. Is the legal profession going to be an aristocratic profession where the wealthy remain able to go to law school, or is the legal profession going to be a profession that welcomes people across not just the racial and ethnic continuums, but across the economic continuum? It has to be affordable for people. If we are losing need-based aid to create merit-based aid, I think that's a problem.
One of the aspects that I think has so many people upset about this issue is that they were under the impression that the point of a law school is to educate people in the area of law and get them accredited so they could go on to practice. The response has been that law school, to a large extent, is a business. Is that too cynical, or is that simply the reality? I mean, there seems to be a bit of a perception problem when it comes to the point of this part of our education system.
I would say that's cynical. I don't know that I would say that that's too cynical. Maybe it's too cynical. Law schools are multiple things. They're academic units in a university. They are businesses. They have to generate revenue.
Profitable businesses.
For the most part, I think people overstate the extent to which they are profitable businesses, but they, generally speaking, I think they are probably adding something to the bottom line of the university with which they're affiliated or the company. There are some for-profit law schools that are generating revenue. But the other thing law schools are is the gateway to the profession, right? And they're not just educational institutions trying to transmit knowledge, the law, but they're also transmitting a culture, right? Knowledge of what it means to be a lawyer, to be a member of a legal profession. To me, part of what is most at risk with both the lack of transparency in employment statistics and the lack of transparency on scholarship programs is the modeling that law schools are doing, which is modeling maybe sharp practices, if you want to think of it that way. Yes, we know we could disclose this, but it's in our self-interest not to, so we're not going to do that. I don't know that that's the best role model to establish for students who are entering a profession where self-interest is supposed to be put aside in the interest of serving the client and serving justice.
So what would the ideal system look like?
Well, I personally think the non-competitive scholarship program is the better scholarship program, but put that aside. You can have a variety of programs. I think there has to be disclosure of renewal rates. So, and I mean disclosure of renewal rates. So the law school says 60% of our entering class gets a scholarship of some sort. 37% of them retain that scholarship. So roughly 35% don't renew. Students can then make a discount calculation. Here I have a non-competitive scholarship. I get to keep it for 3 years. If it's $10,000, I know I have $30,000. Here it's a competitive scholarship offer, also $10,000, but I realize I've got a 35% chance I'm not going to keep that. That means it may only be worth $6,500 the next 2 years. So that's not $30,000, that's $23,000. Right? They need the math so they can do that calculation and weigh those competing offers. Right now, that's just not there.
All right. Well, Jerry, we're going to have to leave it there for now, but I want to thank you so much for coming in. This was really interesting.
My pleasure.
That's Professor Jerry Organ. He's a professor of law at the University of St. Thomas School of Law. If you'd like to learn more about the cases or issues we just discussed, go check out our offerings on BloombergLaw.com and also on the Bloomberg Terminal. I'm Pacchia. Thanks for watching.